There are battles fought with guns, and then there are battles fought with dignity. But when a homeowners association tried to shame a disabled veteran over violating neighborhood rules, they had no idea they were about to learn a lesson they'd never forget. Because this time, the soldier they targeted wasn't just any resident. He was a man who had spent decades fighting for a country that suddenly claimed his flag didn't belong. Before we begin, make sure you like the video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments. Should a HOA have the power to decide how someone honors their service? For years, Master Sergeant Daniel Hayes, a retired Army engineer, had lived quietly in a neat suburban cul-de-sac. His home sat on a gentle corner lot shaded by 2 old oak trees. The neighborhood was peaceful, predictable, and calm. Exactly what Daniel needed after a lifetime of deployments. Scars and memories that still haunted his sleep. He didn't bother anyone. He didn't ask for anything. He simply tried to live with dignity. But there was one thing about his house that made it impossible for him to blend in. A tall, polished flagpole anchored in his front yard, one he installed himself. Not for decoration, not for show, but because raising the American flag every morning was the only ritual that kept him grounded. It reminded him that all the pain, all the sacrifice, all the friends he lost, meant something. But one quiet morning, long before sunrise, an envelope appeared taped to his front door. Bright red ink, bold letters, a tone colder than steel. Notice of violation, unapproved structure, immediate action required. Daniel stared at the paper for a long moment. He didn't blink. He didn't react. He just breathed out slowly, the same way he used to when defusing bombs. The Homeowners Association, one he always paid on time, one he'd never argued with, one he'd never bothered, had decided that his flagpole was a visual disruption to uniform landscaping standards. In simpler words, they thought it looked out of place. By noon, 3 HOA board members showed up at his door, clipboards in hand, polite smiles masking sharp arrogance. The president, a woman named Marcia, spoke as if she were addressing a child who had made a mess. "Mr. Hayes, you are required to remove the flagpole within 10 days or you will face escalating fines." Daniel didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even frown. He simply asked, "May I ask why?" Marcia's answer stung more than she realized. "It violates aesthetic guidelines. We're trying to maintain a certain standard." A standard. That word hit Daniel harder than any battlefield memory. He looked at his hands, the same hands that carried wounded soldiers, repaired vehicles under fire, and saluted brothers he'd never see again. And now, after all that, someone was telling him his flag didn't meet their standard. He nodded politely. He closed the door. And for the first time in years, he felt something dangerous rise inside him. Not anger, not rage, resolve. Because if there was one thing Daniel knew how to do, it was standing his ground. But what no one in that HOA expected was this. Daniel wasn't planning to fight them with shouting, threats, or anger. No, he was about to teach them a lesson they would remember forever. A lesson in respect, a lesson in honor, a lesson in what it truly means to be American. And the way he would deliver that lesson, they would never see it coming. The next morning, the neighborhood woke to the soft hum of lawnmowers and the distant bark of dogs, the kind of quiet suburban peace people imagine when they buy homes behind HOA gates. But on Cedar Lane, something felt different. People noticed it the moment they stepped outside. Sam Carter's porch, the same porch that had been flagged by the HOA the day before, looked exactly the same. The small wooden ramp he had built himself, the flagpole he installed years ago, and the potted flowers his late wife once planted. Everything looked normal. But the HOA wasn't done. Just after 8 a.m., a white SUV rolled slowly into the neighborhood. Inside sat Mark Renshaw, the HOA president, a man who took rules more seriously than relationships, more seriously than common sense, and certainly more seriously than human compassion. He parked directly in front of Sam's house, stepped out with a clipboard, and an expression that already carried judgment. Neighbors peeked from windows. Some stepped outside under the excuse of grabbing mail. Others whispered among themselves. Everyone knew the HOA had confronted Sam the day before, but no one expected they'd come back this quickly. Sam stepped out onto his porch, slow but steady, using his cane for balance. His posture was stiff, his expression unreadable. But his eyes were sharp, alert, and unshaken. Mark didn't waste time. "Mr. Carter," he said loudly, making sure the nearby neighbors heard, "this is your official warning. You are in violation of 3 HOA regulations, and if immediate corrective action isn't taken, you will face daily fines, escalating penalties, and possible forced compliance." Sam didn't speak yet. He just listened, truly listened, as if he were back in the military, receiving a briefing from someone who thought they outranked him. Mark continued, now with a tone that carried more authority than respect. "These violations include unauthorized property modifications, non-standard exterior additions, and an unapproved ramp installation. According to HOA guidelines," but Sam slowly raised a hand, not rudely, not aggressively, just firmly. "Mark," he said calmly, "I built that ramp because my knee collapsed 3 years ago, and I installed that flagpole long before any of you showed up. That flag has been with me longer than half the people living on this street." Mark blinked, annoyed that Sam interrupted his script. "This isn't personal," Mark insisted. "These are just procedures." Sam looked at him with a faint, tired smile, the kind older men give when they already know the truth. "Rules should protect people," Sam said softly, "not punish them." Behind Mark, 2 homeowners exchanged glances. One nodded, silently agreeing, but Mark didn't notice. He was too focused on power. "Well," he said sharply, tapping his clipboard, "consider this your final warning. You have 72 hours to remove or alter all unauthorized modifications. If you don't—" Sam finished the sentence for him. "You'll fine me. I heard you the first time." Mark's jaw tightened. "Just follow the rules," he snapped. "Everyone else does." Sam shifted his cane slightly and spoke in a calm but powerful tone no one expected from a man in his 70s. "I spent years of my life fighting for this country. I followed rules that mattered, rules that protected freedom, dignity, and human life. But what you're trying to enforce here isn't about safety, it's about control." A ripple of reaction moved through the neighbors watching. Mark's face flushed with frustration. He opened his mouth, ready to fire back, but before he could speak, Sam turned and walked back toward his house. Slowly, yes, but with purpose, pride, and the steady resolve of a man who had already survived far more dangerous battles. And then he said something that made the entire street go silent. "I'll respond to your warning," Sam said without turning around. "But not in the way you think." The door closed behind him. Mark stood frozen, clutching his clipboard tighter than before. He looked around and saw the neighbor's eyes, not fearful, not obedient, but curious, almost rebellious. For the first time, he realized the HOA might not be the one in control anymore. Inside his house, Sam exhaled deeply. He wasn't angry, but he was disappointed. He sat down at his desk, pulled out an old metal box, and opened it. Inside were documents, military papers, civic awards, and letters that proved something the HOA had clearly forgotten. Sam Carter wasn't just a homeowner. He was a man who had spent decades understanding structure, discipline, and leadership. He knew how systems worked and how they failed. And now, for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt since his service days. Purpose. He leaned back in his chair and whispered to himself, "If they want to talk rules, then let's talk rules." Because Sam had discovered something important the night before, something the HOA didn't expect anyone to notice, a loophole, a forgotten clause buried deep in the community's original charter, a clause that gave every homeowner far more power than the HOA wanted them to believe, a clause that Sam was about to use, not out of revenge, not out of pride, but as a lesson, one the HOA would never forget. And the neighborhood? They were about to learn what happens when a veteran approaches a problem not with anger, but with strategy. The next morning, the neighborhood felt different. Not louder, not angrier, just awake. Word about the veteran's silent protest had spread far beyond the cul-de-sac. Neighbors who had never spoken to him before suddenly slowed their cars when passing his house. Some nodded in respect. Others whispered among themselves, wondering what the HOA would do next. Inside his home, the veteran wasn't celebrating. He was planning, because he knew one thing better than anyone else. A battle is never won by reacting. It's won by preparation. He pulled out a thick binder from his bookshelf, one most people would ignore, but not him. He had spent a lifetime reading the fine print, analyzing structure and understanding systems. And now he applied the same discipline he once used overseas to the HOA rulebook sitting in his hands. As he flipped through its pages, something caught his eye. A rule. That wasn't really a rule. A line that had been added years earlier without proper approval, without community notice, and without the required signatures. The exact line the HOA used against him. The exact line that labeled his adaptive equipment unauthorized. He leaned back in his chair, exhaled slowly, and whispered to himself, "So this is what they overlooked." Not anger, not revenge, just the calm clarity of someone who finally understands the battlefield. Instead of calling a lawyer, he did something far more strategic. He began writing. Not a complaint, not a threat, a proposal. A complete restructuring of the outdated rule, crafted in plain language, supported by state regulations, disability access laws, veteran protection policies, and the HOA's own charter. He backed every point with evidence, ensuring it was stronger than anything the board could push back with. And then he added one final paragraph, a paragraph that wasn't about rules at all. It was about people. He wrote about what it meant to come home from service and face new battles in the place meant to be safest. He wrote about neighbors who forget the sacrifices made quietly next door. And he wrote about responsibility, not just his, but everyone's. Responsibility to act with decency. Responsibility to stand up when something is wrong. Responsibility to make a community worth living in. When he was finished, he placed the proposal in an envelope and walked it directly to the HOA president's house. The president opened the door, stiff and defensive, the way people stand when they expect an argument. But the veteran didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He didn't demand. He simply handed over the envelope and said, "Read it, then decide if this is the kind of neighborhood you want representing you." Then he turned and walked away, leaving the president holding something far heavier than paper. Accountability. Inside that envelope wasn't just a rule change. It was a mirror. And for the first time, the HOA would have to look into it. The morning that changed everything didn't announce itself with thunder. No storms, no shouting, no drama. Just a quiet sunrise over Maple Ridge and a single envelope taped to Sergeant Daniel Reeves's front door. It looked harmless, white, clean, official, but the message inside carried a weight that would make even the calmest man's chest tighten. The HOA had issued a final violation notice. The letter accused him again of non-compliant behavior. They demanded he remove the access ramp he built for his wheelchair. They claimed it damaged neighborhood aesthetics, and if he didn't remove it within 48 hours, they would begin legal action and daily fines. Daniel read it twice, not because he didn't understand, but because he couldn't believe that after all he had done for the country, after everything he sacrificed, there were people who thought a wooden ramp was more offensive than the idea of denying a veteran basic access to his own home. He placed the letter on the table and inhaled slowly, the way he learned in the military when facing a situation that demanded calm over anger. But his daughter Emily? She wasn't calm. She had seen this pattern before, the insults disguised as rules, the pressure disguised as procedure, and this time something inside her snapped. "This isn't about a ramp anymore," she said, pacing the living room. "This is about power. They're testing how far they can push you, Dad." She wasn't wrong. For weeks, the HOA board, especially its president, Charles Whitmore, had poked and provoked, hiding behind technicalities. Charles liked control. He liked being right, and he especially liked reminding people that he had authority. But this time, he crossed the wrong man. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't express outrage. He simply looked at his daughter and said quietly, "Well, then it's time." I reminded them who they're dealing with. He wheeled himself toward the garage, away from anger and toward purpose. Inside, he pulled open an old military storage trunk. The metal clips were worn, scratched by time and memory. Inside lay carefully folded uniforms, commendations, mission logs, and something far more important, documentation that proved federal protections for disabled veterans. He lifted a folder with hands steady from discipline. "Not rage. Emily," he said, "get your camera." She blinked. "Wait, you want to film this?" Daniel nodded. "If they want a lesson," he said, "we're going to give them one, where the whole neighborhood can hear it." That afternoon, Daniel and Emily set up a small folding table right on the edge of the driveway, exactly where the HOA officials loved to stand when lecturing him. They placed the ramp violation notice on the table. Then Emily set up her phone on a small tripod. Daniel waited. It didn't take long, like clockwork. Charles and two HOA members marched down the street, clipboards in hand, puffed up with authority. "What is this?" Charles demanded as he approached. "A protest? A stunt?" Daniel kept his expression neutral. "No," he said. "Just a conversation. One you've been avoiding." Charles scoffed. "There's nothing to discuss. The notice stands. The ramp must be—" Daniel lifted the folder. "Before you finish," he said, "you should know I brought something. Something you neglected to check before issuing these citations." He opened it slowly, placing documents on the table one by one like a surgeon. Preparing instruments, protected veteran status, federal ADA regulations, state disability housing laws, military housing protections, federal non-discrimination statutes. Charles' face shifted. Slightly, barely, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. "This neighborhood," Daniel continued, "is under federal obligation to provide reasonable accommodation for disabled veterans. That ramp?" He tapped the violation notice. "That ramp is not a violation. It's a right." Charles tried to speak, but the words tripped over each other. That's not how we interpreted." "Interpretation," Daniel interrupted softly, "is a dangerous game when you don't understand the rules." Emily's camera captured everything. The neighborhood began to gather. People whispered from porches and sidewalks. Some watched in disbelief. Others watched with the uncomfortable realization that they had stayed silent too long. One elderly woman stepped closer. "Is it true?" she asked. "They've been fining you for your wheelchair ramp?" Daniel nodded. A wave of shame rippled through the small crowd. People who had once avoided the conflict now felt its weight. Charles cleared his throat, trying to salvage control. "This doesn't change the fact that the HOA has guidelines." Daniel leaned forward. "And I have federal protection." Silence. Heavy, cold, unavoidable. He continued. "You've spent weeks trying to intimidate me. You wrote letters. You issued threats disguised as policy. You treated me like a problem that needed to be corrected." He paused. "But I've faced men 10 times more dangerous than you. And I didn't break then. I won't break now." The line hit like a hammer. Even Emily felt her chest tighten. Charles stepped back, face flushing with embarrassment. Not because he disagreed, but because he suddenly realized the entire neighborhood had just watched the HOA get dismantled by a man who didn't raise his voice, didn't lose his temper. He simply told the truth, and the truth crushed them. "This conversation isn't over," Charles muttered. Daniel shook his head. "It is for you." He closed the folder and added, "From here on out, every notice, every complaint, every interaction will be documented and reported to state officials, to federal disability offices, and, if necessary, to the media." Charles froze. The HOA members looked at each other, uncertain, nervous, suddenly aware that their power had limits they didn't want to test. Daniel lifted the violation notice, tore it in half, and let the pieces fall to the ground. Not out of anger, but out of certainty. A message to everyone watching. This is what happens when you try to bully the wrong man. Emily ended the recording, heart pounding. Her father turned to her with a simple nod. "Post it," he said. "Let the world see what happens when an HOA forgets basic humanity." And she did. Within hours, the video spread through the neighborhood group chat. By the next morning, it would spread much farther, but that part of the story belonged to another day. For now, for the first time in weeks, Daniel Reeves felt like he had reclaimed something priceless, not just his dignity, not just his peace, but his voice. And voices like his don't stay quiet. By the time the neighborhood gathered again that evening, something had shifted. Something deeper than rules, fines, or HOA power. It was the feeling that a man they had overlooked had just taught them more in 2 days than the HOA had taught them in 10 years. Captain Raymond Hale stepped outside just as the sun melted behind the rooftops, casting long shadows down the street. He didn't look like someone who had won. He didn't celebrate, didn't smirk, didn't throw his victory in anyone's face. Instead, he looked like a man who simply wanted peace. But the street wasn't done with him yet. One by one, neighbors approached him, not with fear, but with respect. Some apologized for not standing up earlier. Some thanked him for showing courage they wished they had. And some simply said, "We didn't know your story." Raymond didn't blame them. He never wanted recognition. He never wanted people to treat him differently. All he ever wanted was to live quietly in the home he built, in the country he served. But what happened next changed everything. The new rule. No one saw coming. At the emergency HOA meeting, now held publicly and with more attendees than ever before, the board sat stiffly at a folding table. They looked smaller than they had just a day earlier, stripped of the arrogance they once wore like armor. The attorney had already delivered the verdict. The HOA had no legal authority to limit flags, small yard installations honoring veterans, or accessible modifications for disability. Not only that, Raymond's case exposed multiple overreaches that could have cost the HOA thousands in fines. But Raymond didn't want money. He didn't want punishment. He wanted change. So when the crowd quieted down, he stepped forward, not to attack the HOA, but to offer something unexpected. He proposed a new amendment to the neighborhood charter. One simple rule: any resident who has served in the military or has an immediate family member who served may display any symbol of service, honor, or remembrance on their property without restriction. Gasps filled the room. The HOA board froze. And then, something remarkable happened. The neighbors applauded, loudly, genuinely, from the heart. Raymond didn't expect support this overwhelming, but the street had finally understood the lesson. Honor isn't something you regulate. Sacrifice isn't something you limit. Respect isn't something you enforce with fines. It's something you live. The HOA sign that changed everything. Weeks later, a new sign appeared at the entrance of the neighborhood. No one knew who ordered it. It read, "This community honors those who served." Underneath were 5 small emblems: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard. Simple, powerful, unmistakably inspired by one man's stand. Raymond paused in front of the sign the morning it went up. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. But he did something rare. He placed a hand over his heart. Behind him, neighbors walked their dogs, watered their lawns, and waved as they passed. Not out of politeness, but out of genuine gratitude. It wasn't about patriotism versus HOA rules. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about a community rediscovering something it had forgotten. Freedom isn't free, but respect is. The HOA president's unexpected visit. The old HOA president, who once threatened fines and removal orders, showed up at Raymond's door one evening. His hands shook as he held a small wooden box. He cleared his throat, struggling to speak. "My father was a Korean War veteran," he finally said. "I never talked about it. Never appreciated what he carried. When I saw how you fought not for yourself, but for everyone, it reminded me of the things I forgot." He opened the box. Inside was a folded flag, aged but carefully preserved. It was his. "I want you to have it." Raymond stepped back, stunned. He refused at first, but the man insisted, tears building at the corners of his eyes. So Raymond accepted, not as a symbol of victory, but as a bridge between 2 men who finally understood each other. Forgiveness can do what rules never can. It can rebuild a neighborhood. The lesson everyone took home. When all was said and done, this wasn't a story about a disabled veteran versus an HOA. It wasn't even about a dispute over a flag or a ramp. It was about a single moment when a community remembered who they were supposed to be. A neighborhood is not defined by fences, rules, or perfectly trimmed lawns. It's defined by people, their stories, their sacrifices, their humanity. And sometimes, it takes one man who has already fought on real battlefields to remind everyone else that some fights aren't about power. They're about principle. By standing his ground calmly, respectfully, and firmly, Captain Raymond Hale did what he had done all his life. He served. Not a country this time, but a community that desperately needed leadership. And in the end, even the HOA learned a lesson they would never forget.